All right, so for this, I'm going to talk to a recipe API. And I'm going to have list of recipes on the left, favorite recipes on the right. Week 4 breakout. Okay, I'm going to create an index.html file. Set it up. I'm going to add jQuery. Everybody have their coffee for the day?
I drank so much I felt sick before lunch and still can't wake up.
That's the worst.
Yeah, if you don't get like food and then drink a lot of coffee, it's like not good. I do the cold brew is stronger, and I like one time didn't have breakfast and I had like 2 full cups of cold brew and literally feel like almost fainted.
Yeah.
Okay, so got an app. Let's throw a main in here. Let's throw a header up here with an H1 that says recipes are fun. And let's do that default style, get rid of that ugly Times New Roman. Actually, you all have graduated, so I'm going to use Bootstrap. Actually, I'm going to use Bootswatch. I don't know if I showed you guys that. It's basically Bootstrap with custom themes on it. Let me just show that real quick because it's pretty sweet. So you use Bootstrap just like you normally would. It's all the same classes and everything, but they have various themes that you can use. So like dark and journal and paper and readable. So I'm going to use this slate one, but code is exactly the same. It just looks like this instead. Exactly the same as a regular Bootstrap site. Okay, so let's give the body a class of container, and let's see what happens. Recipes are fun. Yeah? Cool. So now here's what I want to do. I want to make an API request. I'm going to go out to Recipe Puppy. They are a free recipe API. It's not the best. They have minimal data, but it's really easy to talk to. Okay, so you can pass in a list of ingredients and then a search query and then the page number, and that'll give you back recipes. So let's just do query equals cheese. Okay, we find all the recipes that have the word cheese in them. Looks good to me. So this is what I'm going to make my API request against. In my app.js, we'll do the ready function. I am going to just create a function called appReady and put my stuff inside of there. Has anyone watched my walkthrough video for galvanized personnel? You have. So you saw me do this. I would, like, in terms of like organizing code, I would start here. Basically, anything that can be in a function, put it in a function. Because then when we start to pull things out, it's easier to just grab that block of code and put it into another file. Because if you have lots of global variables and like things that are dependent on each other, it can be a lot harder to start to split things out. So every time I do something, I just create a new function for it. Okay, so when the app is ready, we want to get the recipes. So I will create a function called getRecipes that does that. This will do $.get, pass in the URL. Other thing is I'll create a variable for the URL because I might need to use it elsewhere. So let's do API URL equals that thing. Yeah, right now we'll default to cheese, but we'll make it dynamic later. So get the data from that URL, reach into the sky, look away from the screen.
You're recording this, right?
I am recording.
Is the $sign appReady, is that like a go-through document?
Yes, yeah, so this is the same as doing this, which is the same as doing $.ready, exactly. Yeah, so the shorthand there is you just pass a function in, and that function will get called when the app is ready. So I could log right here, hello from jQuery. Okay, so get the recipes, and then show recipes on page. I'll just call it show recipes. It's not going to be too verbose. This is going to be another function that shows the recipes. So it should accept the resulting data or something like that. And let's just log it out for now. So when the app loads, hello from jQuery, no access control allow origin. What error is this? CORS! Okay, I'm just going to fix it by using a CORS proxy. So now, I'll do this. I'll say const proxy URL equals that. And the API URL equals proxy URL plus that. Now let's try it. Cool. So we're getting data back. This specific API is not that great in that what I'm seeing right here is actually a string. It's not a JSON object. So to fix that, I can just say get. You'll notice how it doesn't say object and I can't expand it and like look at the properties and stuff. So it looks like a JSON object, but it's actually one big string. If I do get JSON, then it's an object. Okay, so right inside of here, I have this results array. That's going to be the thing that. Question?
Yeah. I'm just curious, like, if that's specific to this API.
It is very specific to this API. Let's watch it happen. So we can actually look at the network tab. We can see when this request goes out. Where is it? Cheese, right there. We'll look at the response headers. Content type text / JavaScript. So the server isn't saying JSON. They're just saying, here's some text. Do with it what you will. We know that it's JSON. So by putting, it's basically doing the exact same thing as json.parse when you get back the result.
That's not because of the CORS proxy. It's just,
No. Yeah, that's just their specific API. And so json.parse, but if I do it get JSON, it does it under the hood for me, so I don't have to worry about that. Cool. Yes?
So if I'm already receiving a JSON string and parse it as a JSON, is there any problem with this approach?
You shouldn't have to, because if you do json.parse and then like pass in an object, yeah, it's expecting a string anyways. Yeah, so if it's a JavaScript object, no need to parse it. Okay, so now the results are what we want to show on the page. So I will do result.results. I don't like it. Let's do this. Get recipes is going to, no, I don't want to make it too complicated. Okay, let's just call this response. And then we'll say recipes are response.results. And I should be able to log recipes. Okay, now we're just getting the array. So now I want to show them on the page, so I'm going to do recipes.forEach, add recipe. So then I'm going to create a function that is called add recipe that takes in a single recipe, and for now, just logs it out.
So for that last one, so for the for each though,
Yeah.
I guess this is just about like what you're passing in recipes. How is it getting recipes again?
Yeah, so I'll do it this way first so we can see it. So for each takes in a function where the first parameter is going to be equal to each value inside of the array. So I'll just do it like in line like this first. So this is console log is going to get called for every recipe inside of the array. So now instead of seeing the whole array, we're going to see each individual one. So basically all I did was put a name on this. So this function is now called add recipe, and then just defined out here instead.
Okay, so the recipe though in the online 21, the recipe that you're passing in, so
For each is doing that for me.
You don't have to do it.
Yeah, so like
it's just saying like that's what is in each index.
exactly, and I can name it whatever I want. It's basically that parameter is equal to each value inside the array.
I always that and the other thing I was just like
Yeah.
you don't have to pass anything in, but then you have to define the function with like that.
Yes, exactly. And basically for each under the hood is just calling that function for us. So now add recipe, we want to add it to the page. So let's do like an X marks the spot. We'll do, let's just put it in main.
Do you always class your body, or I always put a div under the body, and
Put everything inside of
For a
it?
container, yeah.
Yeah, you could. It depends on how you want to do things. This just gives everything padding. So the header, the main, and the footer are all going to have the same amount of padding. It's totally up to you. I'm going to create a div, give it a class of recipes, and that is where I'm going to append it. So right here, I'm just going to say, hey, jQuery, give me the thing that has the class recipes, and append a new recipe. And here, we're just going to do a p tag, like with the recipe title. And I think it's, yeah, recipe.title. That should do it. There we go. So now we're getting all the names of the recipes on the page. But here's what I want to happen. I want to have like a left column of all the recipes and a right column of like favorited recipes or something like that. So let's do this. We'll have a div class equals row. And then inside of that, I'll have a div class equals column s. We'll do xs-6. So this will take up 6. And I'll give this a class of recipes. That's where they'll get appended. And then on the other side, I'll have another column 6. And that'll be my favorites. So recipes over here, favorites on the right. Yeah, and let's also add the image too. So let's log the recipe. Let's see what else we get. So we're getting title, ingredients. Some of them have thumbnails. Yeah, so let's add an image with a thumbnail inside of it. So here, let's get crazy with it. Okay, so because this is a backtick string, is everyone in the room familiar with backticks? Yes, mostly? Quick refresher. Template. So what this allows us to do is basically string concatenation without all the plus signs. So you have your string in backticks, and anywhere you want a variable where you would have concatenated it in, you use this syntax, $, curlies, put a variable name inside of there or an expression, and it'll be like concatenating the whole string. So what I just had there is equivalent to just like one big long concatenated string. So it's this plus recipe.title plus a string that has the p tag in
That
it.
won't work with single quotes.
This will work with single quotes.
The $.
Oh yeah, so the $ only works with backticks.
And then
You
dollar
never
sign
get it
is
to work before,
not
that's why.
by jQuery. That's not nothing.
No,
to
this
do
is
with
ES
template.
2015. So it's new in the language. So I do this all over the place just because it's so much nicer than this. Like you have plus signs and dashes everywhere. Here you can just put it in line. So what that allows us to do is you can also have new lines in here. So you can do that and the string is still valid. So do some cool stuff. So let's say I have a div and then we'll end it with a div. This itself has a class of row. And then inside of it, I'm going to have another div. And this is going to have a class of, we'll do like column extra small 3. So this is going to have the image in it. And so then inside of here, I'm going to throw the image tag. Source is going to be equal to recipe.thumbnail. And then Bootstrap has an image responsive class, so it'll automatically resize it. And then right below this div, I'm going to have another div. And this is going to have class equals column dash xs. What is 12 minus 3?
3.
What's 12 minus 3? 9.
I did the other math.
Okay. So it's a 12 grid system. So this one's going to take up 3 columns. This one's going to take up 9. So right here, let's have like NH4. That's going to have the recipe title. And then, is there a description? There's an ingredients list. we'll do the ingredients list then. And then a p tag, not that. With recipe dot ingredientes. Okay, some of them don't have a thumbnail. It sucks. Let's find a different search term. How about tomato? Is that how you spell tomato?
No,
Tomato. Ancho chili. Wait, are we showing the title in 2 places? Oh, because I'm appending too. Oh, I'll leave that. Cool. Beautiful. And now like resizes. This is a little too big. Let's do this like an H6 if that's a thing. It's like as small as the p tag. We'll just make this a span then. Or not. Let's make it small. Okay. What was I doing though? Oh yeah. We're trying to potentially share some data.
Like maybe if the recipe was, like you just had the titles or something of the recipes, and then you clicked on it, it took to like a page which had the ingredients or something. And then
Yes, let's do that. I like it. Cool. Actually, let's just do that. So over on the left, we list the thumbnail and the title, and then when you click on it, over on the right, we'll list the ingredients. Okay, I like it. So let's remove the ingredients from here. So now we just see thumbnails and titles. Pretty nice. And let's also give it a nice little class with some margin. So we'll give this a class of recipe. Over in our styles, I'll add a style. So we'll do dot recipe has a margin of 2 ems, maybe. Wait, no, we'll do padding. Because margin would mess up the flow of the row. Then we'll bring it in.
when you're using columns, you can do a lot of padding, so you don't have to like, because would margin
Yeah, 'cause-
mess up the column, like your div 12?
Exactly. Well, yeah, because if you mess with the margin, then it pushes the elements to the around it out as well. So if you had the 12 column grid, it would push them down to the next row. So by doing padding, it's in there, and so it stays as like this. This still takes up only 6 columns instead of like 6 plus margin. Okay. So when we click a recipe, we want to show the ingredients over on the right-hand side. Okay. First, let's just get a click handler going. So right here, this thing is like the recipe element, right? So I'm going to create a function that creates this element, so I'm not doing it all in line. So right here, I'm just going to say const recipe element equals create recipe element and pass in the recipe. And this function, create recipe element, takes in a recipe, and then it's just going to return jQuery with all that inside of there. So we got the element, and then now we will append the element. Works in the same way. So what this allows me to do, though, is to add a click handler to that specific recipe. So right here, I'm going to do recipe element dot click. This is going to be a function. Let's create it. Recipe clicked. Down here, I'm going to make a function, call it recipe clicked.
Do you have to do the clicking though after you append it?
No. So the idea there was by creating the element first, I now have access to, I could add event handlers, I could append to it, I could do all sorts of things before I even append it to the actual recipe list. Because basically this right here,
So it's like adding it and then, okay,
yeah, and mainly it's because this is a jQuery selector. So I'm returning a jQuery element that has like click handler and stuff on it. So recipe clicked, and then let's just log this, which is going to be the element that was clicked on. Okay, so we get that row. Cool, cool. We get that row. We get that.
Scooby-Doo.
What's that?
When you say that row, it sounds like Scooby-Doo on row.
yeah.
Oh, that row. Row. Cool. So we've got the click handler working. So let's try doing, let's just logging this.text content. Let's see what we get. Okay, so we're getting the actual title of the row because that's equal to the thing that we clicked on. So we can then use this information. So basically, I want to search through that array, find the recipe that has that title, and then show the ingredients on the right-hand side.
Is it giving you spacing?
Yes. So and you'll see it's basically because the text content of this outer element includes like the div and everything else inside of it. So if I just want the content itself, I could do that .trim. That's a built-in function to JavaScript. Removes white space from both sides. So now I'm just getting just the title. Yeah. I will say.
You don't like keep the information essentially.
Well, that's what I say. Like,
getting.
I could add like data attributes. Like there are other ways of like keeping the information on the element itself.
Yeah.
But I'm going to show basically. Let's say this is all the information that you have, and you need to make the API request again to use that data. Cool. So let's do that. So really, I could just do this. I could say, well, actually, get recipes like reappends the recipes. So maybe. Yeah, let's do this. Or should I? I will. Yes, okay. So get recipes just simply gets the recipes, but now I'm going to say get recipes returns the get. So then outside of it, I can use .then. So out here, I can say get recipes, then show recipes. So what I'm going to do down here is say get recipes, and then we'll just define this function in line. Call it response. Here we'll just log the response. So each time I click on a recipe, I'm going to make the get request all over again and then log it in the console. So click on a recipe, get request all over again. Click on a recipe, get request all over again. Click on a recipe, get request all over again. And if we look at the network tab, that's actually what's happening too. Like each time I click it, it's requesting that exact same data again and again. And I don't want to do that because it is the exact same data. There's no purpose in requesting it again. I just need to get access to it. So the first way of doing that would be basically as a kind of like a global variable, but you wouldn't access the global variable directly. So here I'm just going to say like const data and initialize it to null. Or let's call it like recipe data. It's going to set it equal to null. And then in get recipes, I'm actually going to set that data. So right here, I could do something like get JSON, and then I have a function that accepts the response. And in here, I'm going to say recipe data equals response.results. And then just return recipe data. Well, return, yeah. Well, actually, in this case, I would return response, just to keep everything working the way it is. So what I've just done here is when this GET request comes back, it's going to reassign this thing so it's no longer null to be the value of the array. So by doing that, we can actually access it. So now, instead of making this GET request down here, I'm just going to log recipe data. Okay. Assignment to a constant variable.
Why did you
You're right.
put null instead of like a regular?
You could do that too.
No way.
Yeah, really, I honestly want it to be null just because I'll talk about it in a second, but I don't want anybody to use that variable. The only way they should get access to that variable is by calling this function, because this function will decide whether or not the API request needs to happen. I'll show that in a second though, because right now, down in this function below here, I'm just using the global variable. So by the time this thing has been clicked on, recipe data would have already been set because the GET request already happened. So now, when I click on one, no GET request is made. I'm just accessing that global variable. So we could make it work just like this. So let's do that. We'll say, basically, we need to find the recipe. So we'll say find recipe, and we'll pass in the title. So right here, this variable is equal to the text content, and we'll say find the recipe with that recipe title. So here I'll create a function, call it find recipe, This will take in the title. And in here, I can iterate over recipe data. So I could do a filter or a for each. Let's just make a basic for loop. We do for recipe data dot length. And in here, we'll say if recipe data at I dot title equals title, then we want to return that specific recipe. So right here, we get the title of the recipe that was clicked on. We then pass that title into this function, which will then return the actual recipe object itself. See what happens. So now we'll click this, and we get ancho chili. We click this, and we get that one. Click this, we get a different one. So I searched through the array. I found it. Now I could show the ingredients. So let's do something like show ingredients. Pass in the found recipe.ingredients. And then down here, I have a function called show ingredients that takes in the ingredients. And it just sets the ingredients. So right over here, on this one, let's call this ingredients. So right here, I'll say, hey, jQuery, give me the thing that has the class ingredients, and set its HTML, because I just want to replace whatever is there with the ingredients. Okay, click this, get that, and that. It's so nice. Okay, so this is one way to do it, and basically the way I did it.
Two separate pages too, is it similar? Like if instead it opened a new, or took you to a new page, so it's just
So the thing is, if you go to a different page, all of your JavaScript variables go away. So if I were to go to this /page2.html, I lose all my JavaScript variables. All those requests would have to happen again, which is okay. But you would probably want to, if you do have separate pages, you would want to have one JavaScript file that has your API request in it, so that way you could call it from both files. I think I'll just do that to demonstrate it. But basically, this function right here should be in a separate file, so that way you can call it from both. But to kind of just recap what I did there, basically I have a global variable, initializes it to an empty array. Then when we actually do get the data, we are setting that variable equal to the data when the data has been gotten. So then later on in our code, we have total access to that array. There's no need to make another GET request or anything like that. So basically, you have a global variable, it's empty to start, and then when you get the data, you reassign it. Then elsewhere in your code, when it uses it, it will have the latest data. So this is probably the simplest way to do it. And yeah, questions or comments about this one? Will? Yeah.
Any downsides of doing it this way?
Really, just because it's a global variable, just because the fact the flow of this thing, the fact that this click handler won't ever even get added until the data already exists anyways, allows that there's never going to be a time where I try to access that and it's empty. But what if you have two competing functions, they both want to show data about the recipe on the page, but they're one of them isn't making the GET request? Basically, you could run into a situation where another function accesses this and it's empty, and then a few seconds later it gets populated with the real data, but that function that ran before it didn't have access to it. So that's what you could run into. But if you're doing it in this style of you're not really accessing the data until an event has happened, you won't exactly run into that. I'm going to show a much more manageable way to do it. Cool. I think at this point, I actually am going to create multiple files. So, but before I do that, let me just do something. So let's do this. So this get recipes function, this is just basically talking to the API. I want to create basically an object that has this property on it, call it a method. So that way I can just say API.getRecipes, or API find recipe, or API get recipe by ID. And that object would have all of those things inside of it. So I'm going to do that right here. Right here, I'm just going to say, let's do a const API equals an object. It's going to have a get recipes property that is equal to get recipes. So basically, I'm just assigning this value equal to this function right here. Now, by doing that, and let's move this to the top. Now, in doing that, I no longer want to directly call getRecipes. Now I'm just going to say api.getRecipes. So everywhere that I'm calling getRecipes, I guess, is really only right there in the app ready. But now, instead of directly calling that function, I'm going to say api.getRecipes. Now, really nothing has changed. The only thing I've done is created an object that has that property. But now I could pull all of this into a separate file and call the file like api.js, and then in this file have access to api.getRecipes or api.whatever else. So code is basically exactly the same, but now it's in an object, right? It's going to work exactly the same way. I haven't really changed anything else, but now it's in an object. Now let's move it into a separate file. So I'm going to call it api.js. And here, it might be tricky that I'm calling it const. Let's just see what happens. Basically, I want to move all of this into api.js because none of these other functions care about the URL or anything else like that. They do care about this recipe data array, though, which we're gonna take care of in a second. So let's basically just get rid of that. And so now, well, we won't get rid of it. We'll have it in this function.
Export it?
You can't export in the browser, so we have to come up with a new trick. But yes, so now we've defined that there. This is here. It's going to break. API is not defined. What would I have to do to make it defined? Go ahead.
That's the index.
Yeah, so bring it into the page, right? Because right now I'm only bringing in app.js. So I also need script source api.js. And it should be first because it's defining the thing that the other file depends on.
Is there a way to do someone like wait where it waits for all the scripts to load when we're doing anything or no?
Potentially, but this is really the way you want to do it. Like what should come first, and that like what doesn't depend on anything else, and then what depends on the thing that's above it. So in this case, API is kind of just like standalone. It's not really using any functions from another file, but app is using API, so it should come after API. So now, works just fine, but when I click, does it work? Okay, so it still works because of that global variable, but I don't like having just this floating recipe data around here, so here's what I'm going to do. And actually, let's just do this. This will return response.results. Over here, this will just take in the recipes. And yeah, voila, just works. Cool. So we see it on the page, but now when we go to click, wait, why is that working? There is no recipe data. Hard refresh. What? No way. Like, there's literally no recipe data variable. Oh. Okay. Yeah. And I am I'm basically creating a global variable right there. I don't want to do that. So let's get rid of that. Now when I click, recipe data is not defined. So instead of just depending on that variable existing, the other function will ask the API for it, but we're going to do something special in the API. So now down here in this find recipe, we're going to do basically, we got to do some promise foo. Who listened to Berto's promise lecture this morning? Okay, you probably, I don't know if you even talked about doing stuff like this. It's going to get intense. Okay, so we need to find the recipe that has the title. So first we say api.getRecipes. We'll then say then. This will be a function that accepts the recipes. Okay, and so now for loop can happen just like before, but this needs to be recipes instead. check it. So over here, we want access to the return value. So this should return a promise. So I'm going to return this promise. So then right here, I'm going to say find recipe. Then I have a function that accepts the found recipe. And inside of that then shows the ingredients. This is all about like waiting for the promises to be done before you actually use the data. So find recipe, pass in a title. Here, this gets the array of recipes, which is a promise. We have to wait for it to finish. So it gets the recipes. Then when it's done getting the recipes, we iterate over the recipes array and find that exact recipe. But the way promises work is if another function returns a promise, then the function that calls it can use .then to access the value that was returned from it. So basically, find recipe is a function that returns a promise, so I can put .then on it. This .then is going to get called with the last return value from this promise. So this promise returns a single recipe, so it's going to call this function with a single recipe. I'm going to share this code. It's a lot to take in. I would dissect it and like console log stuff, really see what's going on. But ultimately, we're waiting for promises to finish before we do things with their resulting data. And then lastly, we get the data back, so we show the ingredients. So that's there. Wait a few seconds, and it shows it. But right now, it's actually making another API request. So each time I click on it, it's calling get recipes and then making that API request. So what I want to do is I want to change my API so that if it has already gotten the data, it just immediately gives it back rather than making the API request. So let's do that. What's that? Dispatch?
Yeah.
No, it's basically just, it's called the revealing module pattern. Here's what I'm going to do. Instead of just defining the API like this, I'm going to define a function that is called API. Inside of here, I'm going to create a variable called recipe data. Set that equal to null. And now this function is going to return an object that has access to get recipes. Actually, let's define this in here. Let's put it in a variable. So we'll say const methods equals that. Then we'll return the methods. And then right here, we'll actually define the getRecipes function. OK. What I have done is instead of just straight up defining an object, I've defined a function that will return an object. It's returning the exact same object, right? But in doing that, I now have this thing called a closure. So outside of this function, nobody can access recipe data. So over here, instead of saying API, I'm just going to do something like, say, const API, well, lowercase API equals API invoked. Because in this case, the invocation of API returns an object with the property called getRecipes. OK. It's returning an object. And let me just return it in line just to see. Yeah. So when we call the API function, we get back an object that has the getRecipes property. It's going to work exactly the same way, but now it's inside of an object. It's kind of encapsulated. Now here comes the magic. So right here in getRecipes, I'm going to check to see if recipe data is empty. So here I can say if recipe data, actually say if not recipe data. So if there is no value inside of recipe data, I need to make an API request to ultimately get the recipe data.
Does that just mean null?
Yes, so if it's null. It's a truthy falsy thing. So because it's null, that's false. Not false is true. So if recipe data is null, call the API.
So it could be any false value.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Otherwise, I want to return promise.resolve recipe data. basically immediately resolve a promise with the array of data that I have. But then the last trick is, the first time that I get the data, I'm going to assign recipe data equal to response.results. So basically, the first time this method getRecipes gets called, recipe data is null, so it will actually make the API request. When the API request comes back, we set recipe data equal to the actual array, and then that gets returned. But then the next time this function gets called, recipe data will actually have data inside of it, so we'll just immediately resolve it instead of making the API request. And this variable right here, recipe data, it's inside the closure of API. It's hidden from everywhere else in the app. Like anywhere else, if I try to console log recipe data, I don't have access to it. So by doing this, we're kind of like hiding the details, and now anytime somebody wants that array of recipes, they have to say api.getRecipes. Whether or not that is actually making the GET request or just serving it from the actual variable doesn't matter. So like in this case, it gets it from the API. In this case, it's already gotten it from the API, so it just immediately returns the variable. So now it broke. Assignment to a constant variable. Yes, this should be let. This specifically is called the revealing module pattern. So the idea is you're only revealing the things you want the world to know about and then hiding the variables up here. But yes, API is a singleton because it's the only, you create one instance of an API and use it everywhere else in the app.
So what are the benefits of this approach on using custom event listener? Like once I get recipes, I dispatch an event, and then the other class or object I was listening to this event. Custom event.
You could do that too.
Which one is better?
Yeah, I wouldn't say, it depends on the coding style though, because if you're doing like the dispatch thing, the other thing is like waiting for the message. Otherwise, if you code it this way, that all the interface looks exactly the same. Like they're both saying get recipes, but one of them is going to be like waiting while the other one like, yeah, the idea is like it's the same interface into the data rather than having to worry about like firing off events and listening for them. So
overall, like, you know this stuff like really well, and I know that it now is really organized, but would it be, for us, would you suggest trying to be as organized as possible from the get-go, or just trying to get things to work and then like removing the functions and like separating them?
I think do what works for you. Like for me, I have to code that way from the beginning or I won't go back and refactor it. But you can find the time to refactor. That said, if you can get in this habit of like typing the function name before you even define it, and then like giving it good names, so like create recipe element, add recipe, show recipes, recipe clicked, it just makes the code easier to read like the next time you see it. So rather than seeing just like a bunch of embedded functions, you see things that have names on it, so it's easier to infer what the code is actually doing. But I get what you're saying. You might take this like one function at a time. So write your function in line, make sure that's working, then pull it out and give it a name and make sure it can still work in that way.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I was doing with like, okay, log it first. Okay, that function's working. Now let's make it do something else. Yes.
What's resolve doing?
It's basically, it's creating a promise that is immediately resolving so that the then of the thing that called it will immediately get invoked. So if,
Resolving meaning completing?
yeah, so in promises can be resolved or rejected. A resolved promise will call the dot then. A rejected promise will call the dot catch.
Gotcha.
So when this returns the data, that's basically resolving the data inside of this function. Whereas here, I'm resolving the data immediately instead of making a request.
More just curiosity than actual like use for this, but so is there a promise dot reject? Like can you force a rejection?
Yes, I think so. Let's do it.
Also, if you adjust on return recipe data, it would fail.
It would be, and because,
It would be first in the loop. What if you change the...
well, if I change it to an immediate return value, then I couldn't call dot then right here. Because like that's the key. Because find recipe is going to get called after the data already exists. So if get recipes just immediately returned the value, I wouldn't dot then it. I could immediately use it, but then it would make it funky out here. I'd have to say like, okay, invoke it. If the return was an array, let's use it. If the return was a promise, let's dot then it. So instead, it's basically no matter when you call this thing, you're always going to use dot then. and so you have to resolve it
And
there.
then the return above is just returning an array?
But the return above is returning the promise, which then returns the array. So that the combination of the two is a promise that ultimately resolves to the array. Because this return is inside of a nested function. Cool. But yeah, if I do reject, that'll be fun, because watch it. You'll see it in the console. Uncaught promise. So it basically throws an error, and so instead of using the dot then, you could have a dot catch that like shows an error on a page or something like that.
I mean, I don't know that I'm gonna use that, I was just curious.
Yes, it's possible. I think that's mainly what I was going to talk about. We could talk about moving this other stuff into files. So like,
Bottom line with that is that as long as variable names are shared and both files are v2 and the order of them, you get something defined before it's invoked or called or whatever,
then it will work.
it's all done.
Yeah, and so this comes down to like, API gets loaded first, so now app has access to API. I guess I was going to show, what if we have a second page? The idea of a second page is, okay, let's say app is page 1, and then we have like page2.js. As long as we loaded API on that page, we would still have access to api.getRecipes, right? So by moving this code into this one file, now any page that needs to call this API can just pull that file in, and it has access to an API, just like that.
And just to like ultra clarify, like the HTML is the bridge. You don't reference one file directly with another JavaScript file.
Yeah, so the script tag is the bridge, right? So the script tag is what brings it in, and by them both being loaded on the same page, they're now both accessible.
Could you also think of it as however many script tags you have, it's just one file,
It's-
top to bottom.
It ultimately becomes one big global scope with all of those files inside of it. Yes.
So, what is the better way? Use this like script and call the API.js or app.js, or in the body element, we can just call a function that like a data entry to that app.js or whatever. You know what I mean?
No.
So instead of calling these scripts API.js and app.js, is it better to do that way or the other way, which is body onloads, and then we call the function in specific JavaScript, like something called start in it, and then
Oh.
everything calls everything.
So this way, specifically with a jQuery app, it's all about the app ready function. So pull the script tags in, and then your app ready kind of like is your init. Yeah, that creates a new instance of an API, but basically that's the init function. I think I know what you're talking about though. You can say like onload and then pass in a function like that. And that basically, when the body is ready, call that function. You don't see this as much in, I guess, like modern front-end dev. It's all about like JavaScript is in control, and we'll call things when needed. Yes. Other questions or comments? I will share this code. Question?
I'm just kind of curious, like, say you had a search or something, would that still work on that when you call the API?
So like I'm searching the API, like passing in a custom query parameter or something like that. Then it would get trickier, because instead of just having a single data array, maybe I have an object that keeps track of what was the search term and its result. And so I can see like, if I've made that search term before, return the array. If I haven't, make the request, put it in the object, and then the next time it gets made, call it instead. It would get slightly more complicated, but actually, I don't know, I think I've been talking for like an hour now, haven't I?
Mm-hmm.
I should stop. I'm gonna stop. I'm done. Any last questions?
Recorded that, right?
Yeah.